Hello, faithful viewers. It's been a couple of weeks, but I'm back to review another episode of the science fiction television series Firefly. Today I will be talking about one of my favorite episodes titled Ariel. In case you haven't seen this episode, allow me to quickly recap it for you. The crew has landed on Ariel, one of the central planets where the Alliance is at its strongest, and thus war veterans like Zoe and Mal are at their most angry and paranoid. Mal wants nobody to set foot on the world except for Anara, who has to get a physical to renew her companion's license. River slices Jane's chest open with a knife unprovoked, and this causes Simon to realize that he really has to figure out what was done to his sister. He hires his shipmates for a job. They will pull a heist on the local hospital on Ariel, getting him and River inside so that he can examine her head to find out what the damage is. The payload will be the medicine that will fetch a fortune for everyone. But an obstacle arises to provide conflict. Jane has called the police to turn in the Tam siblings for a nice reward. But things go sour when the police arrest Jane as well. They all wind up escaping, but Mal knows that Jane turned on them, and he is none too happy. But Mal doesn't kill Jane, but he does let Jane know that if he tries anything like that again, he will die. Cue credits. As I said, this is one of my favorite episodes. For one, we get to see just how brilliant Simon really is. We were told by Simon himself that he was really smart in the first episode, and we've seen him do very basic and simple doctorly things since he came aboard the ship. But all that kind of pales in comparison to what he gets to do here. One, he masterminds this whole plot, which aside from treachery was pretty smart. And also we get to see that anyone who ever said that he was one of the best doctors in the verse clearly wasn't kidding during a wonderful scene where he risks getting captured to save a man in the hospital. I've always liked the characters who are able to use their intellect to their advantage, and Simon is able to do just that. This, paired with his unparalleled love for his sister, makes him one of my favorite characters in this show. This episode also follows up on a minor plot point that was set up in the pilot episode, and I have to wonder if this episode was a little bit jarring for the people who were watching the series on television and didn't get to have the luxury of watching the series in order, as the pilot was not aired until well after the series was canceled. If you've been keeping up with my reviews of this series, then you know that in the pilot, the Fed who was trying to capture Simon and River offered Jane enough money to have his own ship. As Jane later told Mal, the money wasn't good enough. But we got an exchange that definitely makes me feel like even then the creators of Mutant Enemy had planned to do this episode. Mal asks Jane what will happen when the money is good, and Jane simply says that will be a very interesting day. Here we see that he definitely wasn't lying. This was an interesting day. I really like how angry Mal gets here. I remember in the commentary for the earlier episodes of this series, one of the creators of the show, Joss Whedon, he talked about how the executives wanted Mal to be a little less broody and sullen in later episodes than he was in the pilot. And for the most part, they succeeded in portraying him in a little bit more of a lighthearted manner. But here we get to see that that version of Mal is not gone entirely, and this is a scenario where I find it very believable that Mal would Hulk out on Jane. Mal's loyalty to his crew is a lot like Simon's intellect. We've had plenty of people talk about it, but we've had precious few moments to see it in action. And this gives us a great idea of how serious Mal is about keeping his family safe. And speaking of the theme of family, we also see that even though Jane has sunk to a new low in this episode, he's not completely a monster. I mean, yeah, he tries to sell out the Tams for money, but one, this isn't exactly an unreasonable thing for him to do. Sure, he is mostly acting out of self-interest. He doesn't want River to slice him open again. But I think that Jane really does care for the rest of the crew, and he doesn't believe that Kaylee or Wash or Anara are safe with River on board. I don't think we would have had an episode of Jane betraying the Tams if we didn't have an incident where River acted particularly dangerous to ignite this choice in him. And then at the end of the episode, Jane seems okay with dying, but he doesn't want the rest of the crew to know that he sunk so low to deserve his death. This is because, much like Mal, Jane really does care about his family. It's just that, unlike Mal, he doesn't consider the Tams to be part of this family. This small moment really does make me feel like Jane has been developed a great deal in the very short time that this show has been going on. He still feels very much like the same character, but he's grown considerably, and at the same time, he has more growing to do. I think if the show had gone on much longer, he would have had some more great moments in him. This episode starts to illustrate that some of the characters in this show don't quite fit in with the premise as well as others. Before watching this episode, if you had told me that Simon would be important to a complicated heist story, I'd have laughed out loud. But he actually does work well in this episode. Sadly, characters like Inara and Shepherd Book don't fit into this kind of story nearly as well. So to prevent having two characters just hanging out on the ship not doing anything, they are written out of the episode entirely. Inara has a physical to go to, and Book is apparently meditating in an abbey somewhere off-world. While I can buy that Inara's duties as a companion would occasionally take her off-ship, as that was established as far back as the first episode, Book having a very vague meditation to get to off-ship is a little sloppy. We don't get much dialogue to explain this other than the explanation that he is not there. Since I'm not above engaging in hypotheticals, I'm thinking that if this show had kept going, Book and Inara would have been written out of the show, or at least given greatly reduced roles. If you'll allow me to spoil the episode Heart of Gold momentarily, we do know that Inara tells Mal that she is leaving the ship. But then we get another episode where she's still on the ship, and then there's no more show to see if the people behind the show would have followed up on this or not. We do know that in the movie, Book is barely more than a cameo, and Inara has indeed made good on her promise to leave the ship. And I've heard secondhand that the movie apparently took the characters all the way through where the show would have been if they had lasted 3 seasons. But I've also heard that the syringe we saw in the pilot episode was apparently something that Inara would inject herself with, and then anyone who touched her would die. So yeah, if this is true, then it does seem like the plan was to kill off Inara. I suspect that the people behind the show realized that if they wanted to keep doing Robin Hood in outer space, which is kind of what they are edging toward in this episode, then they weren't going to be able to keep a preacher as a main character, even though, ironically, there is a precedent for it with Friar Tuck in the original Robin Hood legends, and a companion who is more legal than the outlaws she surrounds herself with. And all of this is kinda a shame because these characters bring something to the table that none of the others do. When you've got a cast of 9, it's good for each character to fulfill a different purpose and be a different kind of character. At the same time, it's understandable that if you want to focus much more on the space crime stories, then you will have a harder time finding things for the non-criminal characters to do to get involved in the story. So it's a scenario that I don't really like, since I really do love Shepherd Book very much, and I don't like the idea that he is becoming incidental in this show. But I can understand why they seem to have been moving toward working him out of the show if they had had a show to work him out of. This episode also highlights one of the big problems I had with the comic book follow-up to this series, Those Left Behind. In that story, we finally got to see the clash between the men with the hands of blue and the crew of Serenity. And honestly, while it's been a little while since I read that book, I kind of felt like the hands of blue guys were demoted to almost being a joke that the Firefly people could deal with without really trying. This episode shows that these guys are nothing short of terrifying, and it makes little sense to me that they would have to resort to teaming up with Cyborg Lawrence Dobbs to get to the crew of Serenity. And they would still fail even at that. It's almost as if these guys are not the same characters as the ones in the Those Left Behind graphic novel. But this is a small problem, and one that isn't even strictly this episode's fault. Overall, I really love this episode. I know I've said it a couple of times already, but it's just fantastic. If I haven't sold you already, I'm not sure what will sell you other than watching the episode itself. This episode is one of the most tense, and even though I'm much more about the cerebral than the flat-out adrenaline rush of action scenes, this episode has some fantastic action, though it doesn't really top the action scenes we got in the pilot episode. I definitely think this is one of the best episodes of this series, and that's no easy feat considering how great this series has been so far. So that's about all I have to say. I hope you guys enjoyed this episode of Firefly, and I hope you found my review helpful and informative. If you did, I encourage you to like, share, comment, and subscribe. And be sure to come back tomorrow for some other kind of video from this channel. And I will give it the old college try and attempt to review the next episode of Firefly next week. Until then, I'll catch you guys later. Have a good day.